I watched the new Nosferatu movie 3 times in theaters already, and I really liked it. It's a classic story about death and love, which is what vampires embody. And for the past few weeks, I've had vampires on my mind, so I decided to explore various unique and interesting depictions of these monsters. Of course, I will be spoiling every title, and some of these scenes do contain blood and some stuff like that, so have that in mind, and let's get started. Willem Dafoe's character in Nosferatu says that God is beyond our morals, and I believe Orlok is as well. His love for Ellen is dark and twisted, yet she is his affliction, and it is because of her that he awoke from his long slumber and killed countless people. He may not be the scariest vampire in this video, but he is the most powerful, as everyone that finds themselves in his vicinity is terrified of him, and some dare not even speak his name. He is death, he is an appetite, he can possess and control those who fall under his shadow. He brings the plague with him, and he's seemingly unable to die from heart puncture as vampires usually do. I still think if 20 people got together and jumped him in his sleep, he would have a hard time winning that fight, but that's alright. The real ending is way more poetic, where Orlok, for all his power, is defeated, because he's bound by the human emotions he can never possess. A part from Nosferatu that stuck with me was the vampire hunt in the Slavic village, where they have a girl on a white horse searching for the monster's grave. And this morbid fairy tale ritual, as Orlok describes it, is accurate to what was going on in Slavic countries at the time during the vampire hysteria. In theory, the horse won't walk over a vampire's grave. In fact, one of the first real famous vampire cases was that of Sava Savanovic, whose story eventually inspired the Yugoslavian 1973 film She Butterfly. It is a very atmospheric movie that perfectly captures that dark Slavic village vibe, where folklore and monsters are very much real, almost like a setting the Witcher would find himself in. This movie also has a vampire hunt, but this one involves a black stallion and no girl, which is supposedly more accurate, at least for the Serbian region. The grave they are looking for is that of the vampire Sava, who has been murdering every miller on duty and stealing the flour. The villagers seek out the oldest woman in the village and ask her what to do. She gives them a general direction as to where Sava might be buried, and they begin their search. After some difficulties, the horse eventually reaches ground he won't walk over, and they start digging. Sure enough, they discover a casket and they stake it with a hawthorn stick. Then, a butterfly that is the vampire's soul escapes from it, and he later corrupts the bride of this movie, ultimately turning her into a vampire in the movie's climax. And there is just something about these old Yugoslavian horror movies that makes these scenes look really disturbing, much like the ending of this movie. The girl transforms into the vampire and she attacks her beloved, riding him through the village until daybreak. And her appearance is worth noting. She turns quite a few shades darker and, interestingly, grows hair on her face, more akin to a werewolf, which is because back then, vampires, werewolves, and zombies were sort of the same thing. There is another entity in this folklore that is essentially a wolf-human-horse hybrid, but that's another story. I was very deep into this stuff a while ago for a D&D campaign. Anyways, even the sound the bride makes is more like a dog or a wolf howling. Which again brings me to Orlok, because in some scenes he sounds just like a rabid dog growling, especially when we first get to see him. You may have noticed that the vampire in this movie is a girl, which I think adds an interesting depth to the character. Of course, there are many female vampires, but they are often alluring or seductive in nature, at least to some degree. However, the she-butterfly starts off as a beautiful girl and then, in her vampire form, turns into a repulsive, feral creature whose only aim is to kill. So she eventually rides him all the way to the grave that was dug up earlier and tells him to take out the stick. He does this, and then she is no longer where she was. Now she comes out of the grave. And I think she does exhibit some lustful tendencies, unless she's just being weird and possessed. But due to her transformation and the fact she attacked the guy, he just stabs her with the hawthorn stick. But in the very last shot, he's laid out in the meadow next to the grave with a butterfly on his cheek. Now, I've seen some weird movies, but this one is a different kind of weird. It has a very dreamlike quality, so it makes sense that David Lynch found himself in it. Nadja is another she-vampire, but she's much more of a classic one than the she-butterfly. She's seductive, has hypnotic powers, and a number of other qualities.
The power to see in the dark, the power to exert their will on weaker minds, the power to penetrate solid matter.
And she's actually Dracula's daughter, so she has ties to Transylvania, and we even get to see the castle. Van Helsing is in this movie too, even though here he's more of an alcoholic uncle. Nadja does stuff for her own benefit. She gets very lonely, so she bites a girl and sends her into a hypnotic trance state. They call it brain fog in the movie. And basically Nadja completely derails her life because she wanted some companionship. But maybe she has been lonely for so long that she lost all her empathy and doesn't care how she affects others anymore. Nadja's brother is also in this story, a vampire who fell in love with a human and tried to cure himself. And he sees vampirism as a curse. He's trying to escape his nature, while his sister, who is older than him, learned to fully embrace it. And even though this is very much a traditional vampire in terms of her abilities, the movie explores her emotions and the struggle to keep this life going. She doesn't want to cure her vampirism like the brother, but it definitely isn't easy for her. Before she bit the girl, she looked like she was questioning that decision, and ultimately she did it despite knowing it's wrong. This movie's vibe is another thing that makes her feel distinct. Everything is black and white, which gives it a weird, detached quality. Some of my favorite moments are just people walking, shots of the city, and the eerie music playing. It has that midnight feel where everything is slightly off, and this does a great job of painting a world where vampires don't just lurk in castles, but also smoke cigarettes in diners and move through New York City like ghosts. Sometimes vampires are depicted as proper monsters, as in the TV show Midnight Mass, where the vampire is referred to as an angel by the avid churchgoers who fell victim to religious fanaticism. It looks very menacing, especially when wearing the church attire. It just looks wrong and blasphemous. It's very tall, has bat wings, and it drinks blood through the neck. It gets some proper scary scenes early in the show, where it's hiding in the dark and you can't quite tell what's going on. And then by the end of the show, when all the cards are on the table, it just goes crazy and has a feeding frenzy through the whole town. What happened was a senile priest found this creature in a tomb and brought it back home to the island where the story takes place. The priest then secretly fed its blood to the people at Mass during the segment where you're supposed to drink wine. And this blood rejuvenated people, made everybody younger, and cured many illnesses. But of course there is a catch. If you die after drinking this thing's blood, you return as essentially a lesser vampire. Not a demon with wings, but you are still bloodthirsty and you perish under sunlight. So the priest essentially created a vampire army under the guise of divine salvation. During a mass, the priest starts giving out poison to everyone who showed up, so they will return reborn since they all drank the vampire's blood already. So this goes through, and all the turned citizens go on a purge through the town, drinking the blood of those who had common sense and tried to protect themselves from this twisted ritual. In the beginning of the video, I said how vampires embody death and love. And although this beast only embodies death, the priest is the second part of the equation here. The vampire would never have access to these people without him. And the real reason the priest brought it back to the island was to rejuvenate his old love, who he has always regretted not marrying. So in a desperate attempt to correct his mistakes, the priest and his love were as much at fault here in the bloodshed as the vampire itself. Another thing I like about this show is how it depicts extreme religious people who believe they are superior to others because of their extreme devotion, and how these people in reality turn out to act the furthest from God's teachings. Like Bev, who is just a horrible person, but she never misses Mass. She has issues, and sees herself as God's favorite. She's among the first to blindly follow the angel, thinking she was finally chosen by God for some greater purpose, not doubting these dark events for a second. This delusion allows her to justify murder, steal from church funds, and even poison a dog. So even though this vampire is terrifying, I think Bev turned out to be the bigger villain in this story. 30 Days of Night is a proper violent horror monster movie, very stylish too. The story is set in a cut-off town in Alaska, where the citizens experience 30 days without any sunlight. It doesn't get much better for a vampire. So the vampire society realizes this, and that if they can just take everyone's phones and eliminate any contact with the outer world, they can just feast on the whole town for a month. And they do exactly that, starting very early in the film. And this is a sophisticated vampire group. They hunt in a pack, and they are quite feral in nature. They pretty much just attack on sight, unless there's some greater plan in place. But in most cases, they are just fiending for quick blood. Humans are really no match for them. The vampires are faster, stronger, smarter, and more organized. You really have to put in work to get rid of even one of them. There is a scene where the main squad is hiding in a house and they hear a girl outside. They want to save her, but then they realize that she's being followed by vampires on rooftops. They sent her out as bait to find the last of the survivors. So even though they are bloodthirsty beasts, they operate like a smart pack of wolves, sometimes even moving on all fours when hunting. And for what this movie is, a survival horror where the opponents are vampires, it's great. The only thing I wish is the vampires looked more monstery or feral to go along with the way they act. They pretty much just look like people, and they sometimes make howling noises. I wish they really went into the beast aspect, like Midnight Mass did. However, this movie is based on a comic book miniseries that has a really unique art style, and in my opinion, has a bit cooler depiction of the vampires. They still look human-like, but the art style of the comic makes them more creepy and alien. Their faces are stretched and angular, their eyes look dead, and they have sharp, jagged teeth. They look like predators that shouldn't exist in the first place. And I like the look of the leader. He has very elongated ears, and his outfit makes him look like a twisted, more bloodthirsty Dracula. The way the panels flow makes the attacks feel frantic, like you're watching their feeding frenzy play out in real time. If the movie is a sleek, stylish survival horror, the comic is the raw blueprint, and in some ways, it hits even harder. Since we are on the topic of comic books, vampires are also a familiar foe of the Nightmare Investigator Dylan Dog, my favorite comic series that I have talked about before on this channel. In issue number 62, vampires are shown as a secret society that managed to infiltrate various high-ranking positions in the world, such as the government, big businesses, and the military. The design of them is very cool. They are just bat heads in suits and uniforms, not explicitly bloodthirsty as in hunting their prey or literally drinking blood. They more so operate behind the scenes, which is arguably more bloodthirsty if we assume their powers extend to causing wars and other disastrous scenarios that result in bloodshed. And the only way to beat them is to drink a serum that lets you tell them apart. But this briefly turns you into a vampire too. The main goal of this society is to destroy all these serums so nobody can tell them apart from humans anymore, which they do succeed in at the end. And the idea of a secret society of businessmen and politicians depicted as vampires feels almost too perfect. Vampires, by their very nature, are predatory. They take what they need to sustain themselves at the expense of others. It's another twist on the secret society trope, but one that hits harder because it aligns so well with the traits we already associate with both vampires and the elite: hidden power, insatiable greed, and a disregard for those they exploit. And I figured this couldn't be a proper list if it didn't have something from the 80s, which is where my favorite movies usually spawn in. And since Near Dark proved to be near impossible to find online, I settled on Fright Night, a fun movie with lots of colorful vampires. This one has a vampire next door situation. He hides behind charm and a calm exterior, and nearly everyone seems to fall in love with him at first glance. But once his true nature is revealed, there's nothing human left. He's a calculating hunter who toys with his prey, confident in his superiority over the humans trying to stop him. This movie also has the largest amount of vampire paraphernalia out of all these movies. It's got crosses, garlic, holy water, stakes, coffins, everything. It even has a vampire hunter, even though he's quite the coward for most of the movie. And with how this movie starts, you would think it's a comedy. But towards the end, it gets quite spooky and even a little disturbing. The transformation scenes are definitely the highlight. And this is from the 80s, so everything is practical effects, or almost everything. When the vampire fully reveals himself, he becomes a grotesque, almost bat-like creature, pure hunger and dominance. Later, he fully becomes a fleshy bat as well. Also, one of the more disturbing parts here is a wolf transformation. It's not a werewolf, I believe it's still a vampire. I guess in this universe you can pick which evolution you want to go into. The main vampire was a bat, this guy is a wolf, and the third guy is some other oozy monstrosity. Anyways, the wolf guy gets staked, and he's chilling under the stairs, very much in pain, and he's making all sorts of sounds, and it's just a strange, sad sight. Even the vampire hunter wants to help him out. And the costume looks very real and convincing. I think this would be a great look for a werewolf movie. What makes this movie effective is how simple it is. It's not trying to humanize the monster or complicate the story. Instead, it's just a fun monster movie that goes into the fear of an unstoppable predator living next door and the struggle of the main character to make anyone believe him. And this vampire definitely isn't the scariest in this video. But Fright Night is still very cool. And this movie gets a lot of bonus points with me for that wolf scene. It makes me want to watch some good werewolf movies next. Now, what if the vampire was really just a mentally ill guy who thought he was a vampire and decided to drink people's blood just because? This might be the scariest scenario because it's the most realistic scenario. Martin is a 1977 psychological horror film which turns vampirism into something much more disturbing. A young man who believes he's a vampire. He doesn't burst into flames at daybreak or seduce victims with supernatural charm. He drugs his victims and drinks their blood, and the way he goes about it is methodical. These moments are quiet and brutal, with no dramatic music or theatrics. Just a kid who looks normal but does something insanely horrifying. What's even scarier is how he justifies it. He's convinced he has to drink blood to survive, and he also claims he's not like the others. He doesn't kill randomly, only targeting people he believes are bad or won't be missed. There's no shadow of Nosferatu creeping down the hallway, just a deeply lonely young man who has convinced himself that this is the way to go. And then there's his family, who makes things even worse.
Nosferatu.
His cousin is an old-school, super religious guy who's convinced Martin is cursed, a literal vampire, which doesn't help anyone. He tries to save him with garlic, crosses, and exorcisms, but all it does is convince Martin further. It's like a feedback loop of guilt and delusion. Martin believes he's a vampire, and his cousin reinforces that belief with medieval paranoia. Instead of helping him, the family makes it worse. There are these black and white flashbacks of Martin attacking women at what looks like a different country. They could be visions of a past life, maybe he used to be a vampire, but I think they're just his fantasies. Either way, the movie doesn't tell you. Maybe Martin himself doesn't know either. What does matter is that he's a very realistic monster, created by his own fractured mind and a family that sucks. This one definitely left me with an uneasy feeling, and it's quite a disturbing movie seeing him do all those heinous things. And perhaps the scariest thing is that this must have happened at least once. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed the video. I wanted to thank you a lot for subscribing and all the support I got, especially on my last video, that one really blew up. But yeah, the next video will likely be Cosmic Horror again, since that one did so well, I already have some stuff ready. Once again, thank you all for the support, and I'll see you next time.